I'm Jaime Levine, and I have with me today Caleb Logan, one of the attorneys in our office at Elder Law Advocacy. Today we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence and the ethical considerations that we're all facing, especially as attorneys, as the world turns to AI as a source of information and guidance and pretty much everything. So I'm just going to read a short introduction. Don't have a teleprompter yet, so I'm going to be looking directly at my notes. Artificial intelligence, if not ubiquitous today, will be tomorrow. The speed of adoption and speed of development is unprecedented. When people have a question, they're turning to the free, friendly, seemingly all-knowing apps on their phones to get answers. And it's not just consumers. Attorneys, law firms, judges, administrators, everyone is using AI. Today, we will be discussing the issues that are being brought up by this reality and how we are attempting to navigate those issues. Caleb Logan is an attorney at Elder Law Advocacy. He is somewhat uniquely qualified to address these issues. He's an electrical engineer by training and made a choice to go into public interest law. He has worked extensively on legislative initiatives designed to protect consumers and older adults, and he's a litigator who has filed and worked on multiple financial elder abuse cases, in addition to working on nursing home rights cases. As importantly, Caleb is very focused on the ethical issues that are coming up daily now as AI rushes into the practice of law. So thank you for joining me, Caleb.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
This is something that is coming up for us every day now. Like, we have a constant barrage of vendors offering us AI platforms, lawyers offering us different ways to start using AI, and then in many other management issues that come up related to elder law advocacy, where, for example, we're going to be implementing an AI reception platform. So that's not really as big an issue as it is in terms of when attorneys start using AI to prepare briefs and things like that. But there are a lot of ethical considerations even with that, because we have duties such as confidentiality. So we always have to be thinking about what it means for us to be sharing information with AI, whether it's us or our potential clients or vendors or whatever it is. So I have a series of questions here, and I'd like to have a discussion with you about what is coming up for us when it comes to AI.
Sounds good. Yeah, and I'd add to that, we're also seeing clients coming to us with sometimes false impressions, I would say, that have been given to them by using AI tools. So definitely
Yeah,
a timely topic.
I think pretty much anyone who's facing any kind of legal issue is probably, maybe not everyone, but 80% of people are probably checking with an AI first before they're calling an attorney, because they may not know that we offer free services, for example. But of course, if you're going to be looking at hiring a private bar attorney, it's not cheap to do so.
Right. Absolutely.
So, first question, how would you describe what's happening right now with AI and legal advice? What does it actually look like for someone sitting at home trying to get help?
For someone trying to get help, if they're relying on an AI system, so a large language model like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or Copilot, I would say those are probably the biggest four right now. It kind of varies by platform just by nature of the way that they've been developed. So ChatGPT, for example, is known for being extremely sycophantic and, telling people that they are right when they aren't necessarily so. Claude has been, at least more recently, pushing back on certain ideas and is also aware of its limitations, such as its, I've had it say to me, for example, that my knowledge goes to July 2025, so anything more recent than that I can't speak to. So it really does vary by platform, but I would say that it's difficult for people just sitting at home on their computer to get an accurate picture of the law without a legal training to inform that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've never come across that. So
Mm.
ChatGPT informed you that it has no information after July 2025?
Claude did,
Oh, Claude,
yes.
really?
And might have been August, but yeah, sometime summer 2025.
Was that while you were using the enterprise version of Claude? I'm just
Hmm.
curious.
Yep.
Really? Wow, that's actually incredibly important to know. Like that is something that people need to do actually
Hmm.
when they are prompting their AIs, not only to try to compensate for this sycophantic tendency that they have, and I
Hmm.
agree that ChatGPT seems to be the most egregious when it comes to that, but also to ask the AI what its limitations are. It's so important to do that just to get that kind of information because laws change, cases come up that change the way that laws are being interpreted, things like that.
Right. And even when you think about lawyers, us giving advice, we always have to caution clients about what we're unaware of. There can always be factors that come up in litigation, for example, that we haven't been, even if we plan for it, we don't necessarily know if they're going to materialize or not. And so we always have to kind of couch our language and say, this is one possibility, but we aren't totally sure. And of course, there are no guarantees in litigation how a case will work out, depending on what information comes to light. And it doesn't seem like the large language models do that at this point, like
Yeah,
to your point.
that's true. And even just the tone, like if you're talking to a lawyer, they're pretty much going to be somewhat circumspect about what they're asserting without doing research on the
Mhm.
fly. But when you're talking to an AI, they may sound like they're the most confident being in the universe.
Right.
And if you're talking to an AI, you might think that they are because they seem to have access to a lot more information than humans do.
Hmm. Yeah, it's the flaw of inductive reasoning, I would say.
Oh, explain that.
Well, so historically, we've programmed things to think deductively. So the easiest way to think about that is we have a condition, so we have an if statement in the code. And then we say, if this condition is met, do this, otherwise, do something else. That's deductive. So coming from, kind of higher up to distilling lower down. Inductive reasoning is different. It's the opposite of that, in fact, and it's really how humans themselves tend to reason. So instead of saying, if this happens, do this, they are saying that every time I've seen this come up, this has been the result. Therefore, that's always going to be the result. So let's say,
Mm.
for example, we're living in Europe or maybe Britain. We see swans all the time. They're white. Therefore, swans are always white. Suddenly, we go to Australia and see black swans. And that example shows how inductive reasoning is flawed because, from a logical perspective, just because your observation results in one, uh, there's one result in your limited, again, observation, that doesn't mean that it's always going to be the result.
Hmm.
There is an opportunity for change. So for AI, and I've encountered this, I've used Gemini probably the most heavily, so that's why I'm mentioning it. I don't know that it has any tendency to hallucinate more than other models, but it was telling me things that would work for one mechanism that it had in mind, but I was talking about something different that didn't have the same tools available to it. So it was just assuming that those tools translated over between the
Hmm.
two mechanisms when they didn't, in fact.
Hmm.
And that is really where the AIs, as you say, they just kind of assume they're right because of that inductive approach.
Oh, so is that kind of an inherent bias to the current iteration of AI platforms? Do they tend to use inductive reasoning instead of deductive reasoning?
For the most part, yes. That was kind of the big breakthrough, I suppose, of the large language models in general, is that they are able to scan through a body of research and then can form conclusions based on that research. So that's inductive reasoning, but it's not necessarily always right. And there are attempts, I forget which context it came up, but you had shared an email from a listserv where they were talking about networks and graphs and nodes, which is how the internet has primarily worked. Basically, it's just a network of associations. So that is a form of deductive reasoning, saying these are related, therefore I need to give this result, essentially. That's how Google historically worked as a search engine. And so that, as applied to large language models, could introduce more of a deductive reasoning approach to it. And so it's interesting how it will turn out ultimately. So at the moment, I believe it would still be primarily inductive. And then it, in some sense, I would also say that the inductive reasoning is even though it can lead to incorrect results, it's also the great benefit of the large language models, because they aren't confined by a programmer saying you need to think this way. They can kind of go out on their own and progress in that way without being constrained by the programmer behind it.
Wow, really interesting. I wonder if Google, since they have this history of deductive search and information provision, will have any kind of advantage as they implement their AIs relative to ChatGPT and Claude, since they're just starting from scratch.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. It is hard to say. I try not to rely on Google's search engine, just as a matter of practice for myself. But it is definitely hard to avoid it because it's system, and I don't know that they are relying on graphs like they have historically nowadays. I imagine it's much more open-ended. But other search engines generally are not as good as Google.
Right.
Just being real about it. There's a new one that I heard about last night from my brother, actually, called Bravo, which he says has been doing well, but others like, we've tried DuckDuckGo, Bing. I use one called Ecosia because they plant trees for the people using it. So it's more environmentally friendly, but at the same time, I often turn to Google.
Yeah, I think most of the world does at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let's get back to the legal application, but that is actually really, really interesting. What is the line between legal information and legal advice? This is something that comes up for us a lot because we have different models of provision of services. So sometimes we have clients who come in and they become clients. And then sometimes we operate clinics where the people come in and they don't become clients, that we just give them information. So what is the distinction between those things, and how does AI have an issue with that?
Well, I don't know that there is a good distinction between them. Honestly, I think that most of what we call legal information we're doing through disclaimers, saying that this is not meant to be legal advice, this does not create an attorney-client relationship. I think in ethics classes in law schools, it's the prototypical example of forming an attorney-client relationship, just talking to someone at a cocktail party. They ask you about a situation specific to them, and, you say, maybe, maybe you just mentioned something about contracts and how a breach of contract might work out. Well, technically, you just formed an attorney-client relationship with them, which is only stopped by a specific disclaimer saying this is just general information. I don't mean it to be legal advice for your situation. You should definitely talk to a lawyer further about this. And so, on the one hand, we can think of legal information as being broader in scope, but it does, at the end of the day, from my perspective at least, come down to making those disclaimers, making sure that the other person is aware that they need to actually form an attorney-client relationship with someone to have an established relationship and get the legal advice that they want.
Well, that's interesting because when people ask AI questions about their legal situation, the AI doesn't give them a disclaimer.
No, not at all. I think they will probably be starting to. And what did, Claude gave me some sort of disclaimer as well once recently. I can't remember quite what it was about, but I think that at least some of the models might be starting to do it.
Hmm. So pretty much anytime you ask a lawyer a question that is related to law, without a disclaimer, they're creating some kind of relationship that would be protected by the guidelines from the state bar or something like that.
Yes, more or less.
But
It's a pretty, it's surprisingly easy, I would say, to form a relationship.
okay, but when you're asking AI exactly the same question, and the AI may be giving you a very similar answer or an answer that doesn't make any sense, there's no disclaimer, and you may be getting great information or terrible information.
Right. And there's an issue as well of even if the information's accurate, it's likely not tailored to the person's needs. So let's say someone is primarily looking at remedies for elder financial abuse, and then the AI suddenly says, well, you should look at Civil Code 1780. You can get a $5,000 penalty or statutory damages. And even if it's true that under the Consumers Legal Remedies Act, you can get $5,000 as statutory damages for people 65 and up, that's not relevant to an elder financial abuse claim. And the claim that the person is actually asking about might not have any relevance to the Consumers Legal Remedies Act because that act spells out about 25 very specific situations in which it applies, and outside of that, it does not apply.
Okay. This relates to the unauthorized practice of law, which is something that we hear about a lot as attorneys. But what what is unauthorized practice of law, and sort of what is the threshold that would constitute unauthorized practice?
It's a good question, and I don't know that I can give a black and white line. It really is a matter of a gray area.
Hmm.
In general, since it is so easy to, you know, cross over the relationship threshold into forming an attorney-client relationship, it can also be easy to venture into the unauthorized practice of law. And so, anytime that someone is giving legal advice about a situation and they are not a lawyer, then that would be unauthorized practice.
Hmm. Well, I mean, there are situations where it's very clear, like if someone's impersonating an attorney
Hmm.
and they are like hanging out a shingle and saying, I'm an attorney and giving advice, and they're not licensed by the state bar or they're suspended or something like that. That would be unauthorized practice of law.
Hmm.
But then there's a spectrum. And so when it applies to artificial intelligence, what are kind of the ethical issues that we're facing right now? What are the platforms offering that we're worried about?
The issue really is that there's no lawyer providing any oversight. So, for example, uh, I mean, we ourselves are very careful with our intake specialists in terms of what information they're giving out to clients. But at the same time, we still provide oversight so we can make corrections. We can, uh, say add anything else for context that's needed. Whereas with an AI, it's just going out on its own, uh, representing itself as qualified in some sense. And of course, AI often sounds very confident in its answers, even when they're entirely fabricated. And so that creates an issue because there is no oversight. And not only that, there are programs being developed by people that say, guide people through the court process, but at the same time, without any oversight, without any disclaimers or anything like that, that is basically doing the legal work of an attorney without an attorney actually doing it, which
Right.
would be unauthorized.
Right. So Let's talk a little bit about the kind of work that AI is doing, and also the kinds of platforms that people are coming to us with. So, um, in a traditional law firm, there's kind of a hierarchy where there's some partners and then there's some associates.
Mhm.
And a lot of that associate work either is now being done by AIs of some kind, or there is anticipation that it will be done. And so their argument might be, okay, we have a group of partners who are overseeing what the AI is doing, which could be problematic. But then also, we're being approached by attorneys who are developing platforms that will undertake some of these tasks for us. And their argument would be, well, we're attorneys. We developed this AI system. It's closed off as far as we can tell. We don't always know how closed off it is.
Mhm.
But those both have issues inherent in them, because where does that supervision end? Like, what would constitute actual sufficient supervision of an AI?
One thing that any lawyer taking AI work product would need to do is review it for accuracy. So if it is citing cases for something, you would need to cite check that, make sure that that case actually exists, make sure that it actually stands for the proposition that it's being cited for as well. Um, and then making sure to review companies' terms of service so that you actually have an understanding of how the data are being used and how it's being retained. That way, you can make sure that whatever data you're putting in will not necessarily be, saved, retained, shared, sold, whatever it may be. So it's an issue of not only uh, oversight, but also of inadvertent disclosure and basically a negligent disclosure in some sense if you're not paying attention to how the companies are actually using the data that you're putting in.
Yeah. You mentioned hallucinations. That's something that we've all heard a lot about. And there have been some high-profile cases in the legal arena where attorneys have submitted briefs or complaints or answers that have been actually drafted by AI and not checked. So,
Mm-hmm.
are you familiar with any of the more egregious cases, or what do you think the incidence is of hallucinations being included in legal work?
I don't quite have a good idea of how often it's happening, although from the reporting, it seems that even, I think we first had it happen maybe in 2023 when the models were first really picking up speed, and it hasn't slowed down since that, from what I've seen and from the news reports. And there was actually a recent news report that I just saw last week about a judge who made a ruling based on a case that did not exist because one person cited it in their argument, the other side did not cite check it, and the case did not exist, but the judge nevertheless relied on it. So that means that there's a failure on one side, the counsel proposing it, the opposing counsel who did not check it, the court who did not check it, whether it's the clerk, the judge, and ultimately the judge is responsible for their decision. But issues like that would result in, fabricated law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, and there have been, I know I can't remember the URL, but there's a website that tracks all of the formal situations where hallucinations have been submitted to courts and it's been
Hmm.
discovered. And I think it's close to 1,000 cases at this point in the
Yeah,
United States.
I wouldn't be surprised. I think the Duke Law Center on Science and Technology, I believe it's called, their Rails uh,
Yeah.
platform might track that issue. They also do track which courts and judges have rules about AI use
Hmm.
in legal practice and briefing and all of that. So could be.
Yeah. Well, for anyone not familiar, we didn't totally um, define what we're talking about. But so there are situations we talked about AI is being sycophantic, but one of the things that AIs do is just kind of make up things. And so the hallucinations are situations where the AI is just, I guess, trying to please their human counterpart and giving them whatever information they think the human might want to hear. So, but
Mm-hmm.
it is kind of odd though that it would just make up a case. Can you talk to that? Like, why are they making up cases?
I don't know if I have an understanding of the technological aspect of it, but I would guess that likely they haven't necessarily seen anything entirely contrary to it. And, I mean, it's still somewhat of a black box as to what they've actually been trained on, so who
Mm-hmm.
knows what they're introduced to. But let's say that they just derive a broad principle, reasoning inductively instead of deductively, and assumes that something should be the case when it's not. And through that, they generate a name and a court and say, this is right on point.
Right. So, yeah, so it's looking at kind of this infinite ocean of cases where there's sort of two sides to a case, and there's a name that looks a certain way and a citation that looks a certain way. And then
Mhm.
it's also kind of taking into account what it's been trained to do, which is to try to find the most likely next piece of information that a consumer might want. And
Right.
it's kind of taking those two things and then not using them appropriately and coming up with just some piece of fiction.
Right, and they are designed to be intelligent. It's unclear how intelligent they always are, but you never know. I mean, just based on the answers, it does seem that they have an idea of legal precedent and which court rules would apply. So let's say we're in the region of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, so that means that the Ninth Circuit is giving the law unless there's a Supreme Court case on the issue. So they can fabricate a Ninth Circuit case, but who knows if they're actually looking at Ninth Circuit cases and reaching that fabricated case. They could be relying on a random state case from Georgia or New York,
Mm-hmm.
somewhere entirely irrelevant, especially on a state versus federal level, but also those aren't even in the Ninth Circuit. So it's that black box aspect is really a problem.
Yeah. Some attorneys have suggested ways to handle the hallucination issue. One of which is take your results from one AI, put it into another AI, and ask it to check those citations, and then maybe a third AI. Um, but I guess it really isn't foolproof. Even if you put it into multiple AIs, they may all be sort of finding the low-hanging fruit online and using some way of reasoning that is not appropriate for attorneys.
Right. And I think there's an issue. I I think I mean I tend to be pretty efficient myself, but on some level just pasting it into a bunch of different AI models is not an efficient use of time in my mind. I
Mm-hmm.
think you can very easily just type in a case on Westlaw or Lexis or Bloomberg or Describe is one of the newer platforms for research
Mm-hmm.
and see if it exists or not. So I don't know why they can't just do
Right.
that.
But if you use something like OpenClaw, you could automate that whole thing. Like you could say, okay, you have this AI do this, then you put it into this
Mhm.
AI, and then you put it in, and then you could actually have it search whatever database you want. It's OpenClaw is kind of just out there.
Yeah, although that would open a whole host of privacy issues that I don't think a lawyer should be getting into at this moment.
I agree. I agree. So let's bring it back to the elder law context.
Mhm.
Is there anything in particular that our clients are facing, given we're talking about people who have, um, well, they didn't have necessarily any background in technology at all. Now they're using computers. They may be in their 80s or 90s, and they may have some of the issues that we see: cognitive decline, isolation, things like that, and potentially they are being targeted in terms of scams. Does AI kind of enter into that in any way?
Well, I do think that from the clients we see, some of them can have a, as I mentioned earlier, false impression about their the ways that they might be able to get relief in court. And with combining that with the sycophancy of an AI model, it's kind of that impression of, well, it said I could do this, and so clearly it's right because it's technology. And I know that's reductive to some extent, but that is what we have experienced from time to time.
Yeah, that's been a problem for a while. Like, I know doctors have the same issue because everyone Googles, or sorry, everyone puts into AI whatever they perceive their symptoms to be, and then
Right.
they go to their doctor and they're like, oh, I have this and this and this and this. And of
Hmm.
course, they're probably not accurate. But it's the same for people with legal issues. They're putting what they perceive to be their legal issues into an AI or multiple AIs, and then they're coming to the attorneys and saying, "Oh, this is my recourse. I need you to file this lawsuit. I need you to write this demand letter."
Right. Right. Or let's say there are very nuanced issues in some areas of the law with, for example, there are, if for people who have heard of the claim of negligence, that's just in general tort law, basically the idea that someone acted improperly when they were supposed to have acted more properly. So we call that negligence. But negligence doesn't apply to, for example, wire transfers in a bank, because the California Supreme Court has said that the California Commercial Code provides the exclusive remedies for wire transfers. And that means that it displaces common law claims. So let's say a person comes to us and says, well, I made a wire transfer, and it's obviously that, or it's obvious that they should have done more to stop me because this was clearly a scam based on whatever number of red flags. I had the phone on the counter. I was talking to the scammer the whole time. I made a clearly uh, irregular explanation for the transfer. I was withdrawing the entirety of my bank account with the transfer. All of that, but to a court, they would say that is not even an issue because the commercial code, again, provides the exclusive remedy. So, false impressions of that are definitely the biggest issue.
That's infuriating. That just that fact that they don't have recourse because the negligence claim doesn't exist.
Right, and I should say the California Commercial Code doesn't provide much in terms of remedies.
Since you brought up negligence, this is a concept that came up with the state bar. We had meetings with the state bar when AI started becoming very kind of popular, and hallucinations were a big thing back then. So it was probably 2023 that we had this initial meeting, and the assertion at the time was that anyone that just relied on AI as an attorney was going to be likely committing some, at least negligence. And I think the anticipation was, and may still be, that in 5 years, if you're not consulting AI, that could be negligence. What do you think about that?
I think it's a matter of balancing caseload and efficiency. And in my mind, there's nothing limiting an attorney from not using AI, or at least not using AI to the extent that they could be, because nothing requires people to take 100 cases instead of 50. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, you are ethically obligated to only take the amount of cases you can competently handle.
True.
So to me, it goes to whether you can still competently represent a client without using AI. And since we can competently represent them without it and have been for a while, I think that it is definitely possible to still do that in the future. I think that it's different from when people were, or lawyers were doing their research in libraries as opposed to on the computer. that's an entirely different thing because I can't imagine how people stayed on top of the law when they had to read pages and pages of books instead of just essentially Googling it. Obviously, the legal research engines are much more tailored to lawyers' needs,
Hmm.
so it's not that simple. But going from that position to the legal databases versus the databases to AI, I don't think I at least don't see it the same.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. How about when it comes to access to justice? Because legal aid and legal services organizations, nonprofit law in general, never has the resources that it needs in order to handle every case that could possibly come in. We don't practice family law here, but I've heard from legal aids that they just don't have the capacity.
Hmm.
And that's true for a lot of different legal arenas. So, is it going to provide an opportunity for legal services organizations to be able to handle more if they are able to give some of that research or some of that document preparation to AI?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a easy way to incorporate it into a nonprofit's practice actually, just because it's pretty easy for a computer to take information and put it on a form, for example. If you're filling out, let's say, restraining order forms or maybe family court forms, maybe a particular petition in probate court. So I think that those things would be easy to allocate to an AI. I would also note that those are the things that take the least amount of time as a lawyer. So, I don't know how how much efficiency savings there will be. I mean, myself, when I was doing restraining order work, I could fill out the paperwork myself in 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So, giving an AI, it might cut that work in half, saying synthesize this client data and then put it on the forms.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you still need to review it to make sure that it actually did it correctly. So, to my mind, I think that it is absolutely promising. It's just a matter of how it's being applied.
Okay. Are there what are the guardrails that would have to be in place in order for AI to be acceptable from an attorney's perspective? And do they even exist at this point?
The main guardrails go to what we've been talking about, I think. So, with preventing hallucinations, giving someone the confidence that the information they're being presented with is actually authentic, that will go a huge way for attorneys. And then also making sure that the data, the company producing the AI models are properly handling the data so that data aren't proliferating over the internet and being shared everywhere and being more accessible to, data brokers, hackers. It, in my mind, creates a whole host of privacy issues that we need confidence about.
Yeah. Um, Prompt injection. Are you familiar with that term?
I'm not actually, no.
Okay. I believe what that refers to is um, when you have an AI that is whatever the purpose is. So, say it's one of the big ones that we're talking about. Um, if you have something that's sort of automated, especially with like an open claw type of situation, prompt injection would be basically a hacker getting into that mechanism that you've created
Mhm.
and putting in nefarious information or nefarious guidelines for the AI to be following, and no one knowing. So, is that something that you've heard of? It seems to be really diabolical and something that could just undermine sort of everyone's primary purpose, which is sort of trying to use AI to do something positive.
Right. So I haven't heard of it myself, but it seems entirely plausible because if someone's intercepting network traffic, they can easily, they can change the network traffic and send it to a recipient it wasn't supposed to be going to. They can generate, they can spoof the person essentially. And so I think that would apply itself directly to an AI model that's essentially controlling a person's computer. And if someone isn't securing their network properly, then that would leave them open to an attack. And if they don't have proper, like firewall protections, antivirus, if they aren't keeping their computer up to date, and so there are security limitations that can be targeted. If they aren't keeping their router up to date, and there are security limitations that can be targeted, then all of those will be exploited by an attacker. And so the more capability that your computer has with it, in terms of what an AI agent can do, then the more that can be exploited, essentially.
Yeah. One thing that sort of we talk a lot about cybersecurity and what people can do to protect themselves. But the reality is we are kind of protecting our end of it. So our computer, our firewall, like our router, like those things we can set up and protect, but we can't protect what's happening on the other end. And we're all very aware that hackers
Right.
don't necessarily want to go after legal services attorneys or staff. They want to go after big companies because then they can get huge amounts of information. 23andMe has, and some of the credit reporting agencies, and well, I don't want to go too far into who's been hacked, but I know my information's been hacked many, many times just by virtue of my being associated with very, very secure companies. So that's kind of the other part of it. Like we can make an attempt to protect our end of it, but what's happening on the other end? I mean, the prompt injection doesn't necessarily have to come sort of in our open claw setup. It could be, something that's being targeted at Claude or something like that.
Right. Well, there are industry standards for cybersecurity, and that's what a lot of the patches would be based off of. And that's what controls, like, for example, a lot of the protocols that are involved in networking for internet traffic. But there is essentially a shared responsibility model where we have to, as you say, take cybersecurity seriously and do what we can, implement the procedures and protocols that we can, and then the rest would be on the company to keep the information safe in accordance with whatever. I imagine it would probably go by industry standards if we're talking about a negligence lawsuit and deciding whether someone acted reasonably or not.
Yeah.
But that's really all we're left with, which in some extent, and this comes up in the medical malpractice or context, where it almost could be a race to the bottom if you're judged by the level of care that everyone else is using. Well, if everyone is using a poor level of care, then what's the incentive to do any better?
Yeah. What about legislation? Like, what should the government be doing in terms of trying to make sure that there's some minimum safety available to consumers? Do we even know what legislation should look like when it comes to AI? What are the thoughts about that?
I think there are a lot of different approaches that can be taken, and I don't know if I am aware of any specific technological safeguards that can be defined by the government as, a set of minimum security standards. I would be curious maybe if NIST, and I can't recall what that stands for, but they are involved. They are a part of the federal government, and they issue a lot of guidance and recommendations for security practices. So, for example, their most recent password guidance emphasized length over complexity.
Mm-hmm.
So I would wonder if legislators could borrow from maybe some sort of minimum practices that NIST has, for example, promulgated, and just codify that into law. And then beyond that, make sure that data brokers are acting responsibly. If it were me, I'm probably more on the farther edge than maybe most people, because I would say we just get rid of data brokers entirely, since the more data proliferation there is, the more risk there is for it being stolen and intercepted. But at least making sure that they're handling data responsibly, that consumers are aware of the items tracking them, whether it is cookies. And I know those cookie pop-ups on websites are extremely annoying, but that's actually required by the European Union, not even US law. And so at least making consumers aware of how their information is being processed would be useful. And at the moment, we have such little AI regulation that I think any step forward, regardless of the form, would likely be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Well, what is a data broker?
Data broker basically just sells data to third parties. It buys and sells.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, like a lot of the data that Facebook collects, that can be sold to anyone else, any third party in accordance with their terms of service. Although, I think to your point earlier, it's kind of up to us to trust that they're complying with their terms of service.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know, as an internal user or internal personnel would know. So they essentially buy that data, sell it out to any third parties that could be usually marketers, especially.
Hmm.
So that means that the advertising is targeted to you. That data is essentially flagging that this user likes this item or this topic, and so the marketer knows to target them specifically. And basically, I mean, it in some sense it promotes efficiency uh, by better advertising, better using advertising funds, but it's also from another lens predatory in that it's targeting people who are most susceptible to it.
Right. And then, so there are data brokers who are buying and selling data, say from Meta or whatever company, and that's perfectly legal. But then there's also the dark web, where you can buy all the illegally hacked information, like the credit card numbers and the social security numbers and the addresses, all the stuff that gets pulled off of websites illegally. That's also for sale, but probably not by the same data brokers. Those are different entities.
Yeah, I would hope not. I think that there would probably. I wonder how broadly the laws about stolen property apply, because I'm trying to think of a crime that would actually apply to something like that, or maybe even in a civil lawsuit if it could be considered converting property illegally. So I think that there are probably some questions there, but
Yeah, it's a difficult subject, and it's not directly really an AI issue either. It's something that we've been contending with for many years.
mhm.
But the reality is, when those companies get hacked, the real victims are the consumers.
Yeah.
And so, what's our recourse against? I don't know, the hackers. If we could find them, we'd probably have some recourse, especially if they're selling our information, and we are experiencing some kind of damages. But the companies themselves, like if they've not had whatever security they needed in place, or they were just unaware of some security issue that they had, and our information got stolen, what's our recourse against those companies for not doing what they needed to do to protect us?
Right, and it's an interesting question of who to hold liable as well, because should we hold the person who collected the data liable for selling it without properly vetting the practices of the data broker that they're selling to, for example? So, yeah, I think I'm not aware of any lawsuits that really focus on that, but it would be interesting to learn about.
All right. Well, let's see. Last question about AI. Um, is there anything in the legal profession that you think we're getting really right or really wrong right now in terms of AI? Or is there some last thought that you have about what we should be doing?
I think that largely it remains to be seen where AI will go. There are people who are very pro, or not necessarily pro AI, but they're very focused on AI adoption and saying how everyone will be using it. There are others who are less confident that everyone will be using it. And so there's a big question about job displacement that I don't think we have a good idea of as a profession, or more globally as a nation, or even the world. And so I think that even though we've progressed a lot, and really quite a lot, quite rapidly over the past few years, we are still in a stage where we don't want to set things in stone, I think, that don't need to be set in stone, so much as staying flexible so that we can adapt to what happens in the future. And I think that the state bars, from what I've seen, have been largely handling it well from that perspective, saying, we have these ethical rules about supervising someone, whether it's a lower level employee or reviewing someone else's work. So those apply just the same to AI. Same with confidentiality, competency, making sure that you're aware of the technology out there, but also that you're using it well. And so there's a lot that we can do from that flexible perspective that I think has been good, at least from the regulation perspective of the legal profession. But as far as legal practice goes, I think it really just remains to be seen, and it is in some sense a bit of an arms race as to which products succeed, which fail, which ones truly boost productivity versus, uh, you know, like I said earlier, with filling out a form that you then need to review, is that
Mm-hmm.
actually saving work, or is it just causing more work for you?
Yeah.
So it remains to be seen from a legal practice perspective, I think.
Yeah. I think we should also, as a last thought, just remind people that the information and guidance that you get off of AI is not necessarily taking into account all the issues that need to be assessed by an attorney. And also, it might be actually using false information to come up with answers for you. So
Mm.
that's something that people really have to be aware of. And it's pretty likely that when you talk to your attorney after talking to your AI, you're going to get a bit of a different opinion.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So this is obviously a work in progress. AI is changing things drastically in a very, very unprecedented way. And so this is probably a conversation we're going to be having for a very long time, because we cannot fathom where we're going to be a year from now or 5 years from now.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, it has changed so much, as I said, and there are milestones that we've hit that people didn't think we would be hitting by this point. So it will be an interesting landscape for a long time in the future.
Yeah, very much so. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.